Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Manson Saga discussion panel. I'm Paul. That's Danny After Dark. Like and subscribe. And today is a very special day for us here on the old Paulcast. It's been a long time coming, and I can't wait to get to it. So, our guest this evening, for the first of a two-part interview, is many things: musician, spiritual teacher, filmmaker, and for the reason we are here tonight, the author of the Manson File, Myth and Reality of an Outlaw Shaman. All this info and on all his other books and music can be found on www.nikolasschreck.world. Welcome to the Paulcast, Mr. Nikolas Schreck. Hello, Nicholas.
Thank you for inviting me, Paul. Danny, hi, how are you? And now, live from Lookout Mountain,
Yeah.
we can proceed with the interrogation.
All right.
Nice
we have ways of making you talk.
You can try it.
Okay.
I'll never snitch.
All right.
So let's just jump right into just a very great basic question. When and why did you decide to release another version of the Manson File?
Okay. Well, each time I have done anything on this subject, starting in 1988 with the first Manson File, and then the Charles Manson Superstar in 1989, then the Manson File 2011 revised and greatly updated edition. Every time I do it, there is so much more information that comes to me. So I think in 1988 and 1989, I stupidly thought, okay, I'm finished with that. That is enough of this. And of course, that was completely wrong. And then in 2008, a French publisher, Commune, contacted me, and people had known that I had gathered a lot more information. And I think it's important to add that I had not the slightest desire to write about it or to even reveal it or to even talk about it. Because you have to understand, by the mid-90s, I had learned the basics of what the crimes were really about. I had had many conversations, many of them very confrontative and angry, with Charles, saying, look, here's this information, not at all what you told me 10 years ago. And so the rumor that, I had a lot more information, because a lot of journalists and a lot of writers and TV people came to me to ask about this, and I really did not want to do it, because I knew the bullshit it would bring into my life. I knew the deranged nature of the Manson sphere, and I thought, I don't want to do this. Someone else should do it. It's too much of a burden, and I don't need all of the aggravation that will come with it. But this French publisher came to Berlin and met me and convinced me that it was worth doing this revised edition of the Manson File. And so you can imagine all the information I had gathered from 1988 to 2008. And then I talked to Charlie about it, and I don't know if you got that recording that we mentioned.
I've got it queued up and ready to go.
That will illustrate. This is from around the time I spoke to Charlie. And you have to understand, from when I moved to Europe in 1990, I moved to Austria, and then I really didn't do anything about this topic or subject for years. And my connection to Charles was friendly. It was just a friend. Of course, the case came up occasionally. He would tell me anecdotes, some of them quite illuminating and important. But for the most part, when we were done with the first Manson File and Charles Manson Superstar, our relationship was simply that of friends. And probably at that time, I got to know him a lot better as a human being than our initial, because I don't think people get that my initial contact with him was in a professional basis. Was
right.
Let's put out this record. It was as a fellow musician to a musician. I like your music. Let's get your music out there. I like your philosophy and what you have to say. You never get to say it without some idiot interrupting you or, distorting it. So let's do an interview where you are allowed to talk. His idea to make the Manson File, as I've said many times, as an antidote specifically to Manson in his own words, the book by Newell Emmons that he was quite dissatisfied with. So at first our relation, I was friendly, and of course I liked him and we had a good rapport, but it was a professional relationship. It became more of a friendship over those many years, which I think was important in winning his trust. So in 2008, after I agreed to do this hugely updated version, finally, after this French publisher flew to Berlin to persuade me, I talked to him, and I said, okay, will you agree to do formal interviews about these subjects? And we went back and forth. These are the parameters of what I want to ask you about. Will you talk about them honestly? Will you agree? And he said, I won't talk about that. I will, willing to talk. So it was, from that point on, it became like a series of interviews with him. And so I think it would help to bring us back into that time if you can play that tape recording. This is a conversation we had in which he basically agreed, okay, I'll participate completely with this book project under these conditions, and I agreed to them. So if you play that for your listeners or watchers, they'll get the flavor of what our agreement was. And I think you'll see something about his personality, which I will mention afterwards.
Okay,
so
perfect.
Roll it.
All right.
My me, that's me, right? All I'm doing is trying to do the same thing that everybody should, if they had enough brains to figure out that it's get on their knees and do it. It's not a question of what I want to do it. I don't want to do it, but the past has already done it.
Well, you sort of.
So just where your part. Just where your part comes.
Okay.
You're the educator. You're the master manipulator. I don't mean negative.
I understand.
In other words, you can write the books and make the films. You can do all the masterful. You are the master. There ain't no doubt about that. You are him. You are Bill.
I agree with you. Here's the thing. You've got the wisdom, and I swear to you, I just want to get across exactly what you think, what the truth is, with no bullshit.
That's all I'm trying to do right now.
And I really appreciate that. I can tell you mean that.
You know what I find really interesting about that is that he uses the term master manipulator. And the way I pick up on that is that he's like, he knows what control the media has and what the written word and everything has on everybody, considering all the helter-skelter nonsense.
Right.
And he's saying that you can put it out there and like change the minds of people. Right.
But I think it's important to understand too, this is Charlie doing his pimp flattery thing too, of course. And
Yes.
So I didn't feed into it like, oh, wow, I'm the master manipulator. I kind of moved on from that. But I think he meant it sincerely, and he did mean it. But I think it shows you something about our relationship. And I mean, also there's a degree of, he knows that I'm a thorough researcher, and he already knew by that time. We had arguments in the 90s about, look, you told me in 1986 this, that's not true. Here is this. So we had quite a bit of discussion about these matters to do with the crimes particularly. So he also is trying to say, he's trying to be flattering so that I write a more appealing portrait of him. But I have to say, considering that he's considered the biggest control freak in history, except maybe the person right above him as the most hated person in history, he didn't ever try to persuade me to write something different.
Right.
He never said, don't say this. I mean, yeah, to the degree that he said, okay, I'll tell you this much, but I will not snitch on this person. I will not tell you that name. But he was very specific about that, and he was quite cooperative during this period between 2008 and 2010 or so, in which we held these very intensive, what he called interrogations, and I think, he was used to being questioned by cops. Mm-hmm. And I think he didn't quite know, where am I coming from? That I just want to get the actual truth. I'm not judging you. I'm not bringing you to court. What happened? If you're saying this didn't happen, then what happened? And it took a while for him to get used to the idea. This is not a police interrogation that I'm trying to pin something on him. But if he's saying for all these years, that is not what happened. Helter Skelter didn't happen. That's a lie. This is a lie. Tell me what happened. And so it worked out fairly smoothly. So I think that conversation kind of gives you the idea of how the book, this new version of it is a mutation of that version. This work has been going on since the 90s, really, but since 2008 specifically. And then when the 2011 edition came out, the final thing about the making of the book, a funny thing is my French publisher sent him, I had them send him the very first copy that came off the printer, to be very careful that it was the very first. In prison, you have to get a book from the vendor. You can't just send a book to prison. You have to come. So they sent it from France to Charlie, and he got it. And he couldn't read French at all, so he's extremely frustrated, thinking, well, what the hell did he write? And and he's starting to get a bit paranoid about it, actually, which happened quite often with him. But the funny thing is, this edition of the book does not have a complete discography of all of his recordings, because with all the new information I discovered, something had to go from that. So I put the discography up in our Abraxas Circle Facebook group, and it's on our Manson file board for people to read. But so in the 2011 edition, the French edition, at the back, it had all of his records. It has photographs of all of his every album that he ever, all the bootlegs, everything he either authorized or the many things that were just stolen from him. And the point, of course, was to show people who didn't know he is an accomplished musician, and that his music, whether the average moron hates it and thinks it's horrible, appeals to people, and that he's at least as successful as many alternative musicians financially. This is how many. This is how many hundreds of records have been put out, and tapes and CDs, because people like them, and that was the point. How does Charlie take it? And this again is his personality. I heard from other people I knew that knew him. Schreck's trying to sell all my records. He's got a catalog of all my records in it. So that was his first, and that's how he thought. The immediate thought is, if it's my music, I'm being ripped off. And then, I said, no, that's not true. And I described what it is. And when he saw the English edition shortly thereafter, he, apologized to the degree that Charles Manson apologizes. But that too kind of said something about even when I'm trying to show, look, he's an accomplished musician, and his resentment and paranoia creeps in, and he thinks he's being ripped off. So
it'd be hard for anybody to get into the mindset that he's in, considering how he grew up and how many times basically the ball was dropped with anything to do with raising the guy. Like, there's no way he could have trusted anybody to that point.
No, I never blamed him for that. I mean, it could be exasperating, and other people who knew him, like prisoners who knew him very well and were with him all the time, would often try to talk him down from being unusually paranoid about people. I think someone's trying to rip me off. And they would say, no, you're overthinking this. So and I had sympathy with him for this, because of course the way he was raised, his mother, as Ben Gurecki, a friend of his and correspondent, learned firsthand by going to the records in Ashland, Kentucky. I thought this was a myth, and many people thought it was just urban folklore or something Charlie said to make his mother look bad. But Ben discovered the paper that the night that his mother and her brother Luther were arrested for this robbery was the very night that she really did say to a waitress at this tavern in Kentucky, the kid, the waitress said, "Oh, he's a cute kid," and she said, "Oh, you can have him for a mug of beer," and that's what she did. She actually did it.
Jesus.
The police wrote it down. It's not. I always thought he's exaggerating or it's urban folklore, but it happened.
Right.
But I never knew that was the very. So imagine that you get traded for a mug of beer, and then your mom's gone, her brother's gone, and you find out she's going to prison.
Right.
So that's extremely traumatic.
Sure.
And I didn't know that it happened that way. And so, and then after that, his mother has some lover, one of many coming and going, who was basically annoyed by him, cramping his style, having this kid around. And I don't think people grasp. She sent him into the criminal justice system because he was a nuisance. He hadn't done anything. He was thrown. He was just, like he said a million times, garbage people, a throwaway kid. He's thrown into, this very brutal reform system of that time, and he never got out of it. So how could he? And then he was betrayed and snitched on and made into the scapegoat for everything evil in history. So by people he supposedly loved and who loved him, they all threw him under the black bus as soon as they smelled that gas chamber. So I never blamed him for not trusting anybody, because how could he?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a few more questions about the book, and then we've broken it up into parts. We'll try and get through 4 parts in this first interview, and then another 4 in the next. So Danny, you have another question.
Sounds like a plan that we can definitely not fulfill, but
exactly.
like most plans, but it's good to have dreams. So we will try.
We'll shoot for the moon.
Okay.
So with this new edition of your book, who were some of the contacts that changed the game for you?
Actually, an old contact that really changed the game and was in the 2011 edition. A crucial factor was that Zena and I had met Roman Polanski's producer and very close friend and intimate, who was deeply involved in everything going on at the time of the murders, and the cover-up of the murders was Gene Gutowski. In the 2011 edition, he was still alive, and when he spoke to us at length about these things and confided in us, he asked us, I'll tell you all this, but don't reveal my name until after I'm dead. He didn't care that it was eventually revealed, which is interesting. Mm-hmm. But, and I also have to say, at the time we met Gutowski in the mid-90s, I wasn't planning a book. I didn't come to him like, here, I'm interrogating you about a book. It was that his friend, the actor Ferdinand Maine, the night before, by coincidence, it had come up that the story that was told about the murders wasn't true. And Ferdinand Maine told us that, I've said this before, that it's an open secret in Hollywood and among people that knew Polanski and Sharon and Jay and Wojtek, that it was a drug deal between people that knew each other, and that they invited them in, and that was what was covered up. He didn't know much about it. To make a long story short, he said, however, Gene Gutowski is in town, and that was very strange and rare. I'll call him and tell him you want to know about it. And they had been friends for decades. They were best friends. Very weird karmic connections between them that go back to World War II. And I get into their friendship in the book because it's important. And how do we know any of this stuff is because Ferdinand Maine happened to open up one night and introduce me to Gutowski. So a major thing about this new edition is I couldn't reveal much about what he said because it would reveal who he was. And in this new edition, I can go at length about everything he told us and the implications of it. Other important, in fact, I dedicate the book to someone that was extremely crucial to the research, was Bob Estey. If you look him up, he seems like the most innocuous person in the world and the last person you would think would have inside information on this mystery. Bob Estey was one of the pioneers of the disco sound in the mid-70s.
Right.
And he was a flamboyantly out gay guy, exactly what you would think the pioneer of the disco sound would be. Through the actress Sally Kellerman, who he was the musical director for her nightclub act in New York. He was looking to move to California to get more deeply into the music industry there. Sally Kellerman was a client of dear Rudy Altobelli, and
Right.
she said, "Oh, well, I know he has this house that you can stay in." Well, we know what house that was, and he didn't know anything about where he was, Bob Estey. So he moves
Right.
into this house, and then Altobelli, creep that he is, and apparently he did this with many people, said things to terrify him and scare him. And many people have said this to me, showed him the blood on the very couch that was still there, caked after. This is about, this is not that long afterwards. It's the mid 70s. Showed him the pictures of the crime scenes. And in the guest house, Bob Estey was given Abigail Folger and Wojtek's bed that they slept on the night they died. And behind him, and I put this picture in the book at the end where I thank him, there is the zebra skin rug that you see in the crime scene very prominently behind him. And Altobelli gave him Helter Skelter, which he knew was bullshit, but he gave it to him like, "Here, read this book." And then Estey figured out, where I am and what this place is, and that I'm, sleeping in the bed of the victims. And this was the kind of sadistic behavior that Altobelli, he was a very mean-spirited person. So Estey befriended him. So, I mean, I get into this in great detail in the book, but Estey spoke to me at great length as well about everything that Rudy Altobelli told him while they were drunk, while they were snorting cocaine, while they were just using mountains of drugs at Cielo Drive. And he made it very clear that Cielo Drive, because of Altobelli, was the party place, the drug place, and it still was. And with total impunity, no worry about cops coming, that it was the place for, in the mid 70s, still drug deals, cocaine, massive amounts of cocaine and weed in the midst of the disco era. Right. So while, and Altobelli is a gossip, talking about everything that ever happened, drunk off his head on coke, told him everything and told him very revealing things about how well he knew Charlie, basically confirming that he knew Tex Watson very well, that Tex Watson was dealing drugs with Terry Melcher's permission from Cielo Drive. So, I won't get into everything he said, but he was, because he didn't care. He had no vested interest in this. And when I spoke to him, he was actually quite ill. And I think he just felt like I'm not in show business anymore. No one's going to kill me. And I don't even think he realized the significance of some of the things, which many of these people didn't. So he was a very important source that you'll see in the book. But he made it very clear that Tex and Terry Melcher were up to no good, and that Altobelli was aware of all this. And he stressed to me the importance of Altobelli being there for the Melcher residency and the Polanski residency, and people pretty much ignore him. But he is really the key between all of it, So, and that he knew Manson well, and that he, this idea that there was this very brief March meeting, "I know who you are, Charlie," that's just another cover up and bullshit to kind of minimize how well they knew each other, So yeah, so they and you have played often the homosexual that lived in the back tape, which Bill Murphy brought up to him. So
that was and we actually have stuff in our questions about that, because that was such a enlightening interview. And
so those are some. I mean, those are some. There were others. I don't want. It's all in the book, but another very important source that finally gave me a gleaning of light on the fame porn videos was, and actually it's very interesting. When I went to Los Angeles both times in 2018 to go to Charlie's memorial service and ash spreading in Death Valley, which was in November 2018 on his first posthumous birthday. And then again, I went in August 2019 to screen Charles Manson Superstar for its 30th anniversary, which was on the 50th anniversary of the crimes. Many people came to me with more information, and all kinds of things were brought to my attention. And one that I'll mention a few things.
Sure.
A very good friend of Connie Kresge, if you look her up, she was the Playmate of 1969. She was a girlfriend of Victor Lowndes, who was the right-hand man of Roman Polanski. She dated Polanski as well. And she told this friend of hers heard one of my interviews on Midnight Rider, I believe. And she contacted me and said, when you come to LA, come meet me and I'll tell you about that. So what she told me was that Connie Kresge was deeply involved in the making of these porno films, that she was in them, proudly so. You know, it was the 60s. It was, you know, there's not like some horrible thing they were hiding, but that Polanski, Hugh Hefner, and Victor Lowndes, and many other celebrities traded films and videos of celebrities having sex, and that there was a, you know, it was like a hobby. And because they had this new state-of-the-art video equipment that very few people had access to, they felt comfortable sharing it with each other, because the peasants could not see what the aristocracy are doing because they didn't have the technology. So, and she got into, you know, it wasn't, I think, much more complex than just Sharon Tate having sex with people, but Hefner and Lowndes collected porn going back to, I've mentioned this before, Joan Crawford in a porno movie giving a blowjob. Marilyn Monroe apparently filmed by Frank Sinatra. Kim Novak supposedly, allegedly filmed by Jack Warner to blackmail her. A lot of blackmail films of movie stars. And this gets into a whole other layer, which I'm not going to get into here, of a celebrity porno ring that I believe was already going on with Johnny Stompanato. If you look him up, a mafia guy who is related to Lana Turner, and supposedly Lana Turner, the movie star, her daughter killed him. Well, that is a whole other cover-up, but it seems connected. I think what was happening in the 50s was still happening in the 60s. So that was a very important revelation to explain what were these porno films, and a confirmation they did exist. And it was much more to it than just Sharon Tate. She was just the flavor of the month. It was, you know, you name it, everybody.
Right. And one thing that you say,
including one thing important, including Greg Bautzer and Jane Wyman. Greg Bautzer was Sidney Korshak's lawyer, the guy who did the dirty work. So that connects the ex-wife of Ronald Reagan and a lawyer of Howard Hughes and Sidney Korshak, Greg Bautzer, who got Robert Evans the job at Paramount to this porno ring. So people who understand the case will see the implications there.
One thing that's interesting, and I'm skipping a little ahead, but I think that it's important too, because we're talking about it right now, is a lot of times there's a lot of looking down on the porno angle of things that were happening. But you say in the book you got confirmation about it. There was Joanna Pettit, who is a friend of Sharon Tate's, talked about it. And so did, like you were talking about earlier, Gene Gutowski.
Yeah, he completely confirmed it with that. And I must say, Gene Gutowski, without any shame, he was proud of it. He was a swinger. He told us, you know, I dedicated my life to beautiful women, and he had gone through the Holocaust and gone through World War II. And he said, I'm going to live it up for the rest of my life. And he wasn't hiding that at all. He had no shame about, you know, orgies. And he described some of the Peter Sellers, Yul Brynner. He confirmed things that Charlie said. When Charlie Manson and Gene Gutowski are talking about the same thing, but are not even aware of each other really, except as a name, I tend to give it a lot of credence. And and he particularly stressed that his close friend Yul Brynner was very much a collector of porn, a participant in porn. But again, that's not like some salacious thing about how decadent and evil Hollywood is. Why is it significant to anyone studying this case is not because it's, so exciting or salacious. It is because this is a lot of what was being covered up. What all of the secrecy wasn't about. It wasn't always about some sinister thing to do with the murders. It had a lot to do with the very practical and pragmatic nature of Hollywood covering its tracks. So, like any business would. Who wouldn't? Who would want to admit to these things in 1969?
Right.
Now today, you've got celebrities saying, I'm going to a rehab clinic because I'm a junkie, and here's my latest porno video. So maybe young people are thinking, well, what was the big deal? Or not only am I gay, I'm married, and this is another planet we live on in 1969.
Right.
So I think people don't understand how significant it was to protect the reputations of musicians and film industry people at that time, and politicians. And so it's not like I'm wagging my finger about how decadent Hollywood is at all.
No,
it's a significant reason for all the lying and cover up.
Right. And Manson alluded to some of the porn stuff as well in the Murphy interview when he talks about Rudy Altobelli, the homosexual in the back, where he's selling marijuana and porn. And so there's like a weed dealer selling porn. That's a whole different thing.
And that gets into Charlie always was involved in porn. It's in police records in the 1950s, and the significance of Three Star Enterprises, his pimping and porn operation in the 50s, is very much overlooked because it doesn't fit into the cult leader idea. It just shows him as an ordinary criminal doing what ordinary criminal does, which, newsflash, that's what he was a criminal. And weirdly, the way the official narrative tries to make him into some freakish, cult leader messiah, but most of his activities were completely run-of-the-mill crime. So it's important to realize he's making porn with underage girls and homosexual porn and everything he could sell, like any businessman in that business, with Three Star Enterprises. And then he gets out of prison in 1967 and he went right back to it. And there's a lot of the way that the commune presented itself was as Hollywood Productions, where I met many people, we're a film production company, and the bus said on it Hollywood Productions. They had cameras, and this is a very underplayed part of how they presented themselves, as we're a hippie guerrilla filmmaker making collective. Well, they were, Charlie was definitely making and selling porn, whether he shared that with everyone, and he was very compartmentalized. People like Susan Atkins and others were definitely involved in that aspect of what he was doing. And the final thing about this, Bob Esty said that Altobelli had a film company, a little company called Cottage Films. And he was referring to his cottage, his guest cottage. But Esty said that Altobelli was an Anglophile, very much enamored of English culture and British slang. Cottaging in British slang is when two homosexual men would go to a public bathroom when homosexuality was illegal in Britain. So cottaging was like a pun for his cottage films. So now I don't know how exactly was Charlie involved and with Altobelli, but Charlie confirmed to me and many others that he himself was in gay porno and was paid, relatively well for doing that in 1967 at his Universal Studios. So that, it's a very important part of the whole thing of what was happening, and the fear of celebrities and people that were in these films that these things would be seen was palpable. Right.
Do you think that Manson could be compared, and I'm just jumping around a little because we have all these different parts, but
No, I said, well, let's get back to your plan. Let's
no, it's good. It's good.
It's great.
Fine. So with Manson being involved in Three Star Enterprises, and then you say getting out and having the bus, are you saying that it was sort of like a Three Star Enterprises as well? And was it also how integrated they were in Hollywood? Was it a thing like with Epstein where Manson would show up with some girls who were fine to screw around with people?
Yes.
And that's a foot in the door for Hollywood.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've thought of it like this way. If you think of the new Hollywood, when the counterculture started becoming groovy and hip, and these old fogies at the movie studios thought, how can we sell movies to this young generation? Charlie too is a guy born in the 30s. He's not a hippie. He's, comes from the beatnik generation, but pimping wasn't really a very good thing to be doing when there's free love and everybody's fucking everybody for free. All of the inhibitions of the 50s that a pimp could rely on, that you can get a prostitute to do something your wife wouldn't, that had all fallen away because in California it was a perpetual orgy. So, but Charlie used definitely, and would admit it, that he used pimping techniques. And he came with this entourage of girls, and of course that opened the door to him. And I can say that I saw him doing that with me and other people that later he entered. That was how he thought. Not long after I got to know him, and we were working on the first book and film together, he would introduce me to girls, and one in particular, right around the corner from where I lived in Hollywood. And he wrote to me. He said, you can go over there and she'll do whatever you want. And I'm sure he told her to. And I remember he wrote, she's crazy, but that's Hollywood, which I thought was hilarious coming from him. So that he thought of women as currency. There's no doubt about that. And he continued to. And he did that with the Straight Satans. He did that with the Aryan Brotherhood much later in his prison career.
Right.
So that
Danielle, we actually have another question about the sort of pimping Manson and the way that works. Go ahead.
Yeah, so kind of an outsider looking in regards to Manson, it appears as though kind of what you were saying with his pimp tactics, that he was playing everybody, manipulated everybody, lied to everybody. How would you put it, where it looks like he would kind of pin one person against another, where you're my good friend, they're the bad guy, and vice versa. How did you see that played out, not just in regards to women and his pimping tactics, but even with friendships that he had?
Well, yes. I wouldn't. Yes, of course. He always said, I've never lied, but of course he lied often. But mostly he evaded the truth or veiled it. He really did. He tried not to lie. I think he went through some kind of mental gymnastics to come up with weird metaphoric ways to say things that were not exactly a lie, whatever that says about his character. I think he didn't really want to lie, but I recommended to Paul that you read Iceberg Slim, the pimp, because Charlie learned when he was very young, he wanted to be a pimp. He told me this. And he said he said the only thing he regretted was being a pimp. He didn't regret all the other things he did. He did regret using people and forcing young girls. He said he had some shame about that in the late 50s. And when he got into Scientology in prison, he said it was specifically to try to clear his negative feelings about himself. He felt a bit guilty about that. So to get to your question, I remember a particular conversation we had where he was basically saying, I never had a cult, but now all these people think I'm a cult leader. Maybe I should have a cult. And he said, but it would never work because everyone in my cult hates everyone else. Which is absolutely true. And I said, well, wasn't that basically true on the ranch too? He said, yeah, it was. And I said, and by that time I had seen this for years. That's because you play everyone against everyone, these divide and conquer tactics that pimps use, like, this is what they do to women, you're the most beautiful one and I love you and I'm going to buy you a boutique and we're going to move to Hawaii. Those other bitches, I never really like them. They're just for money. You're the special one. And then they tell the next girl the same thing. Well, that's what he did to a lot of these if I can be honest, sad, dysfunctional men with daddy issues just as severe as Susan Atkins or any of the other girls in the group. People, these men looked at him as their daddy, and he flattered them and he played them against each other. And when he saw that they had jealousy, in Buddhism, we call it the three poisons of the mind that create disturbing emotions. Well, when Charlie saw that weakness in somebody, that people would talk to him, I don't know why you hang around so and so. They're horrible because blah blah blah. He would say, yeah, you're right. They're horrible. You're wonderful, and I want you to be. He used this phrase in Charles Manson's Superstar that I thought was funny. He says, all these people playing goo goo gaga trying to be commander of Man Scam. And that's what these people, he got all these people vying for, I don't know what they thought they were getting, but some kind of extra praise, giving them titles, giving them special jobs. And very often, and this actually, he once compared himself to Hitler because he read a lot of biographies of Hitler, that Hitler would give all of his lieutenants the same task, and they'd all go out and diligently try to do it and find out, Goering is doing what Goebbels is doing, and they all hated each other because they thought, we want to prove to the Fuhrer that we can do. And Charlie did this very, so-and-so isn't doing this right. Can you help me? And, oh, of course I can, Charlie. And so he very much played people against each other. He told them all, you're my favorite, and this one let me down. And that all worked until the internet. And when the internet was invented, and Charlie had no access to it until he had cell phones much later, and then he did have a little bit of access to it, then people played the tapes where you're my best friend, and then, oh no, I hate so-and-so, and, and I can give you an example for myself. I'll give you two.
Okay.
For the most part, we had a very good rapport for many years. And really, and this happened when I was talking to Derek Hayes, my friend and his mutual friend. Derek and I often talked to Charlie together on a party line.
Right.
And one day we were having just like a casual conversation, not about anything important or controversial. And as often happened, the German phone line just dropped out from the conversation. Just boop, it's gone. But I could still hear Charlie. He couldn't hear me. And he's going, that son of a bitch, he cock blocked me. That motherfucker hung up on me. And just ripping me to shreds because he thought I hung up on him and deliberately snubbed him. And he went on for maybe 5 minutes about, that motherfucking cocksucker did that, blah, blah. And then I wrote to him the next day. I said, I heard every word you said. You understand, I didn't hang up on you. The phone hung up. And then he, again, when I say his kind of apology, he did begrudgingly apologize, but that's how quick he could turn. And what was it about? I didn't do anything, but he thought I hung up on him, thought I dissed him or disrespected him, which I wouldn't, I never hung up on him. So
right. So was that the
I want to give one more example to show how basically too, we were friends, but again, as I said, newsflash, he was a criminal, he was a crook, and any opportunity he could to engage in criminal activity, he would. And remember, the people he harmed, Gary Hinman was a friend. That was a friend of his, He didn't have any compunction about doing what he did to him. And, I think that's important. When in 2014, by that time, Charlie and I had been speaking about a new edition of the book because the 2011 edition had been out for a few years, and he was giving me all this new information and saying, that's wrong, this is, no, you got that wrong, this wasn't this, it was that kind of thing. I said, all right, then there's no reason to keep it in print. If this all needs to be changed and that needs to be revised, and I'm not going to put it in print. And he said, all right. And then he immediately, I found out, said to other people, a few, and of course different people, hey, can we keep printing the book, a bootleg copy, so he could make money off of it?
Right.
And yet And yet he remained completely friendly to me. And when I presented that with him, he just laughed like that's him. And this kind of explains something about him that I think is hard for people to grasp. He, like, because he lived in prison, he could be friendly with people that are ripping him off. They could be friendly to him because there's considered this dog eat dog. You take advantage and you rip people off. And for like, how could he? Danny DiCarlo was extorting him on the ranch, and yet he was kind of friendly to him at the same time.
Right.
And this is, unless you see prison life where you have to, it's almost like war. You have to learn to deal with your enemy in a civil manner. So it was very hard to grasp, who is this guy's friend? Who is this guy's enemy? Because if someone could make, like, people who paid him, oh, that's my friend, but he privately would hold them in complete contempt. And let me say one fact loud and clear in neon flashing lights. There is nobody on earth, except maybe Cappy and to a lesser degree Lynette Fromm. There's nobody I didn't hear him rip apart with hateful, venomous, everybody. There's nobody. You can't, and at the same time, he might praise them Tuesday, and again, they're a miserable son of a bitch on Friday. So
Right.
if anybody on earth thinks, they were his special girl, then you better sit down, kids, because you weren't.
Yeah.
He had the same, but this was a mood disorder. It wasn't a personality.
Yes.
He literally was he had so much anger and so many, abandonment issues that he just could not allow himself to fully trust people and to have a long-term friendship that was not, he always was psyching people out, no matter how well you knew him. He would always try
and
to
that was just a given to him because of how he was raised. And because you're saying in prison, that's just like, you can be friendly to them, but if they get a chance, they're going to pick your bones clean.
Exactly. So he could be completely loving, actually very generous, very kind, and sincerely so. A lot of people, you read these books that have been written about him, or most news reports, it's like, hello, how are you? Said the cult leader, manipulatedly trying to become a rock star or whatever.
Yeah.
And no, he was genuinely, could be loving, friendly, open, extremely generous. For a thief, he'd often offer me money, or many other people. He'd give away, he figured, and he sincerely believed, people think it's just a con man's trick. Nothing belongs to anybody, so it's all in flow. He really believed that, which is true on a deep, universal, mystical level. But from an ethical point of view, no, it doesn't belong to you. And you're creating pain for this person who you're stealing from. And we discussed that later in his life when death was looming, karma. You're going to have to face the consequences of this. And I always thought it was strange how he was so focused on nobody can steal his words, nobody can steal his music. Even the Rolling Stones stole "Start Me Up" from me one day. I was ranting and raving about, or you name it. Prince is wearing the same coat that I wore, and everyone's stealing from him, and yet he had not the slightest compunction from literally stealing anybody's property. And if he heard or even suspected that someone had any financial resources, he just considered, well, that belongs to me.
Right.
As I've discussed with Charlene Cafritz, and as I mentioned in this recent David Ferrier interview, Abigail Folger. So those are important. And the final thing I'll say about that, knowing this about Charlie and seeing it for decades, anyone who thinks he would get involved in a crime for some bizarre ideological reason, never happened. His only concern was financial gain. Can I get money from it? Secondly, did somebody disrespect me, and do I need to give them a lesson? Those two, those are the only reason he would risk a crime. He would never in a billion years think I'm going to be for some philosophical reason, or, it's just, if you knew the very pragmatic criminal that he was, that's what it was about.
Right. And there's actually a couple of saying that it's about money ties into a couple of questions we had to do with Brian Wilson and the Beach Boys, and also the rock star thing, because it seems like, as with everything in this, there's a lot of half truths. And so Manson was making music with Dennis Wilson and the Beach Boys and stuff, but people say because he got snubbed and wasn't able to become a rock star, that's why he was angry and went on a vengeful crime spree. But it's more that he didn't get paid, and it was a money thing. And you mentioned, and I'd like you to talk about it a little bit, you mentioned that he called them the Beach Boys murders, the crimes at Cielo.
Well,
and was it and Waverly?
Well, yes, both. They were both connected. I mean, there are so many different streams and strands of motive and resentment and tension that led to these two murders. But the way it came up with the Beach Boy murders, I don't know how often he said that, but he said, it's got nothing to do with the Beatles. And he said particularly that was the girls. I didn't care about the Beatles. It's you could call them the Beach Boys murders. And he explained this incident, which I describe in the book, which seemed very important to him. Well, let me set that in context. First of all, you have to remember, in his mind, he's already making some progress in the music industry. And anyone that says this was a talentless nobody peering in and wanting fame and success, he's out of prison for 3 months, and he's at Universal Studios. And Russ Regan, the head of Uni Records, the guy who actually, by weird coincidence, named the Beach Boys, that's a weird synchronicity, even before he met them, is paying for Charlie to go to Gold Star Studios and record in 1967. The guy just got out of prison, and that's already happening. He's got a potential job as a technical advisor on a film at Universal through Gary Stromberg, this Jesus Second Coming film. So, and then Neil Young is already pushing his music to Mo Austin, who I heard from someone that met him still has Charlie's tape, or did have the tape that Neil Young gave him. So he's already on his way to some sort of success. And then he meets Dennis Wilson, but look at it from his point of view. Dennis Wilson, why is it the Beach Boys murders? Where did they meet? First of all, they met at Gary Hinman's house. This whole hitchhiking girls is an embellishment and later exaggeration to make it look like, oh, Dennis didn't really like Charlie Manson. He just wanted to fuck these girls, and it was just good, clean fun. And then he learned how terrible he was, and he dropped him. But from Charlie's point of view, Dennis Wilson brought him into everything. Dennis Wilson introduced him to Tex Watson, who he already knew. And that's very blurry. Did Charlie know Dennis before Tex or after? Charlie himself seemed confused about that. And I'm not sure about the chronology there. I think Tex knew Dennis a little bit earlier or simultaneously. So just to put it in very clear terms, look at from his point of view, he meets Dennis Wilson, and Dennis Wilson introduces him personally. They met at Gary Hinman's house, first of all. So how can you not connect it to the murders?
Right.
He introduced him to Sharon Tate at a party at Elvis's house when Elvis was away. He remembered very specifically. He introduced him to Terry Melcher. Dennis Wilson introduced him to Rodi Altabelli, introduced him to John Phillips and Mama Cass, and the whole Mamas and Papas are very crucial to the point where you could call it the Mamas and the Papas murders, actually, even more so. He introduced him to, without Dennis Wilson, there is no Tex Watson in Charlie Manson's life, or Sharon Tate, or Terry Melcher, or Rudy Altabelli, or Cielo Drive. So that's what he meant. But he specifically told me this story, which I recount in the book, that the recording with the Beach Boys, and it almost seemed from what he told me like they wanted him to be part of the group, not just put out his album, but to actually be part of the recording entity. That's how he put it.
And do you think like it would be tough, and this kind of goes for a bunch of people involved. How do you know what to believe?
You don't. I
Right.
said that's what he said. I don't. It's like
Yeah.
it's out of hearing him talk about it for 30 years. Like if you keep repeating the same thing, you got the impression they were grooming him. Like, I mean, they did actually say, "Come on tour with us to Texas,
Mm-hmm.
play with us." So there was something there. I mean, who knows? It might have been a idea for a week that was dropped. You know, they were all
Mm-hmm.
high and they were desperate. The Beach Boys were desperate for credibility at a time when their career was falling apart, and they replaced the Maharishi, their guru, with this new guru. And
Right.
they you know, so who knows? That's how Charlie put it. So the recording sessions with Charlie were not going well. They went to Brian Wilson's, and Charlie, in his usual way, I don't want to do this. No, I don't want to do it that way. I don't like that. And the Beach Boys are very, you know, Brian Wilson, for all his craziness, was a genius when it came to mixing and mastering and recording. And he really did like Charlie's music. And I've heard to this day, his entourage has to shut him up when he says positive things about Charlie. So Dennis was enthusiastic, but so was Brian, and so was Carl, apparently.
Right.
So they were arguing, and it led to some heated argument, and it looked like it wasn't going to work out. And I can well imagine Charlie doing that, having seen the same thing in trying to work with him. I can totally
like you say,
sympathize.
there's paranoid stuff happening.
Right.
Him.
I mean, if you say, "Hey," I could imagine if you said, "Do another take, Charlie," he probably wouldn't like that. You know, I could the normal things that happen in a recording studio, I think he wouldn't be comfortable with. So they went on tour apparently, and he said that Brian Wilson invited him to Bellagio Road, his house, alone, to have a kind of man-to-man talk with him about, you know, he said, you got to get new clothes, you have to change your attitude, and even gave him singing advice. Like, I really like that song. I don't remember which one, but maybe try it like this. The phrasing, normal thing a musician would say. He's trying to help him. And Charlie did appreciate and respect Brian, I think. I think he did actually like and respect him.
Right.
And then in the midst of this, he said to Charlie, you got to get better clothes, you got to look better, and you should cut your hair, and you should go to my barber, Jay Sebring. And he said that this was 68, and he said when Brian Wilson said that they both heard ding, a bell ringing. And they both looked around, and, you know, he said he didn't think about it again until he went back to Cielo Drive that night. And he said to me, actually, in this conversation, he said, you know, you should ask that guy if he remembers that, as if Brian Wilson would talk to me about Charlie.
You could just call him up. Hey, you want to talk about Charlie?
You know, Charlie wrote to the Beach Boys for years afterwards with song ideas. I don't know what he was thinking. He actually kept writing to the Beach Boys for years. Like, here's an idea, or try this. Or like when Neil Young came to Berlin and I was trying to interview him through his management company, he said, yeah, well, tell him it's about time to get in touch with me and we'll do something. Like it was still 1968, and that might not affect Neil Young's career at this point.
Right. You said something that actually we were going to ask you about, because there's a big divide when people talk about Manson going back to Cielo after the murders. Some people don't believe he did it. Where does the info come from that he went back, and what do you think happened when he went back?
Okay, let me focus on that. In 1986, when Newell Emmons put out Manson in his own words, this was a big topic that we went back to again and again, so I'm very clear on it.
Okay.
He was pissed at Newell Emmons, who he considered a fellow crook. And I knew Newell Emmons. He was a criminal, and he was a drug dealer. And, you know, he was definitely part of the underworld. Charlie was on drugs in Vacaville, very medicated, when he spoke to Newell and told them things that he probably regretted saying a lot. And Newell put it in the book, and there was no firm agreement like this is off the record, this is on the record. And Charlie did say to me several times, I'll tell you this, but don't print this. And I'm sure he did that with Newell. But Newell couldn't record anything. He had to take penciled notes in his car when he left. So who knows what was accurate. Charlie
Right.
was very angry at Newell. I remember specifically because I had to be the mediator between them about these issues, because I liked Newell Emmons and actually thought he was an all right person. I got along with him.
Oh, did we freeze up for a
We
second?
froze up for a second. I guess the CIA.
There we go.
Yeah, look out, Mountain tuned in, and we're getting too close to the truth.
Those damn lasers.
Right. And I was just about to start the MK Ultra mantra that will hypnotize people.
Oh,
you know,
Part two.
Time. Part two.
All right. So Charlie was angry at Newell because Newell writes in a very matter-of-fact way that Charlie, in his own voice, saying, I went back, I put a towel on the man on the floor, which he very carefully doesn't name, as if I don't know who that is, that stranger on the floor, and that he went back to the house. He totally describes it, and that is very much in his own words. I think it's verbatim. But Charlie was angry at him for doing that because he didn't want, at that point, when he was in Vacaville and when he got out, he had a little bit of an idea that maybe he could ever be paroled. He gave up on that, but there was a brief period where he did try to go to classes and make some vague effort at, like, working in the chapel, showing that he could be reformed, you know. And he was very aware of the law that if he went back, that makes him much more culpable.
Right.
And he always said, well, they can't lock me up. I didn't order it and I wasn't there. But if he was there, even if he didn't order it, it makes him aiding and abetting an accessory to the murder. By California law, at least, and I think by most United States law, if you go to a crime scene and you help the murderers cover it up, even if you didn't do it, he knew that. And he didn't like that Emmons put that there. But then, and so he yelled at him about that and many other things in the book. Mm-hmm. And then a few years later, he told me in an anecdote, about going back there. He told me it was the most frightening night of his life. He never felt such a high level of fear. And he told me in detail about going back there and told me he went with somebody who he would never, ever tell me who, though I asked about 60 times over many years. It never even said he or she, which sometimes make me think it's a she because it would be more normal to say he in general as a ambiguous somebody. He had never even specified the gender. I have reason to believe a top contender could be Krenwinkel.
Interesting. What do you think of Tex saying T.J. Walleman
Who knows? I mean, I think that's also possible. I think TJ was more involved in this than we think, though I knew him too, and he claimed he wasn't. I believe he was. I think I spoke to Steve Grogan in 1988, and Steve Grogan was a lot more tough and more of an ex-con at that point. He just got out of prison. He was working as a session musician for Hank Williams, and we talked about the going back, and he was kind of ambiguous about it. I wouldn't totally rule out that he did. I don't know, but I don't know. I get the vibe from Charlie. Maybe at least I think maybe several people went back. As far as I know, maybe they went back and forth. You know, it's very hard to determine. But he did tell me that, and many other people, and many other times he went back. Now, what do I think happened? I think Tex and the girls left a complete panicky scene without any plan whatsoever. And Charlie, being Charlie, that looks to me like his particular imagination to go back and set the scene in a different way. And I think he dragged the bodies around, and I think Tex occasionally says he doesn't remember the rope. I think that's true. I think that was Charlie who went back with somebody and dripped the blood on the blue box that was in the room. And I think he dragged their bodies around, and Now, I don't. Obviously, there was an attempt to make it look like Billy Doyle and Harrigan were behind this, and that's a very important part of the crimes. They
Right.
either, I don't know if Tex was smart enough to do that, or if he was even knew them. I don't know. I don't know who did, but pulling down Wojtek Frykowski's pants and everything about it. And of course, Mama Cass and John Phillips both told the police immediately, this is clearly Billy Doyle, our friend, and Harrigan getting revenge on Frykowski because he was raped there a month before. And that's a very important part of the way the crime scene was presented. To me, that seems like something Charlie would dream up, but who knows? It could have been Tex, it could have been someone we don't know.
Right.
I believe other people were involved in the planning and execution and the aftermath that we will never know.
Right. Do you think that with the what you know of Manson and kind of jumping back to how he used pimp tactics, like I did read that book that you told me to about the Iceberg Slim, and a lot of the stuff lined up with him using people. Do you think that with those murders, do you think he was more involved with what was happening than he put out there, just because he has a good way of massaging people into doing something that he wants them to do?
I don't think he had that much to do with that particular night. And the other thing I have to say, from knowing him, I understand the average person who reads Helter Skelter or whatever the latest permutation and regurgitation of it is, if you didn't know this human being, this person, you could think, okay, he was an evil cult leader who hypnotized. The person I knew had no fear and clearly would go. I mean, why would you think he would get other people to do something he clearly was willing to do himself? Think about the logic here and leave aside your idea that he's a coward who hypnotized people to go out and kill because he was too, craven to do it. On the contrary, he was an extremely violent person, capable of being extremely dangerous on his own. He had already gone over, for no particularly helpful reason, to Rosina Kroner's apartment, made the whole situation worse by shooting Bernard Crow. Did he have the slightest hesitation about going over there and shooting someone and leaving them dead? No. Hinman, Bobby needs help. Okay, I'm over there with a cutlass slashing a friend in the face. Where's the fearful coward? On the contrary, and he was a dangerous person, more than capable of killing someone on their own.
Right.
And he said that many times. Why, I don't need to get someone to do something for me. I'll handle it myself. I mean, with Nick Grillo, the manager of the Beach Boys, and I believe this, the business manager, he went in and yelled at the manager. The manager says, and you can hear that tape that I played at the 50th anniversary of the La Bianca crime. You can hear him saying this. Grillo says, sue me about the $5,000 he wants that the Beach Boys didn't pay him. And Charlie yells at him, I won't sue you. I'll kill you. I'll burn your house down. I'll kill you. He had no compunction. He had no filter. So why do people find it hard to believe?
Right. And that's a really good point, that he just got up and went to those. So why wouldn't he do this one?
Completely reckless. And people, he wasn't a great mastermind, and he wasn't even a particularly good criminal, because to be a good criminal, you have to be cool, calm, and collected, and think twice, 3 times, and 4 times about the consequences of your actions. He didn't.
Right.
Tex took some money, and this guy made a threat to the ranch, goes over and shoots him.
Right. And that's so that
and he made everything worse when he did these things. And I often said to him, why throw your life away for Tex Watson? Why throw your life away for Bobby Beausoleil? Why?
Right.
So
did he ever have any sort of answer to that?
Not really. Kind of vague, actually. Never a very satisfying answer.
Seems like with the way he was, impulsiveness wouldn't have been off of the table. Just being
That's
in that
it.
moment.
If you knew, what's the difference between I accidentally hang up on him and he's ready to kill me, and it's the same temper, the same moods, the mood swings. Like, and also he wanted to show the kids, I'm the man. I'll show them how to handle this. And that's what he said to Bobby Beausoleil, that, this is how a man handles it. And there was a lot of this man, like to Tex too. Tex was a rumpkin. Tex was a little girl in a man's body. I had to show him. And he'd say Linda Kasabian, was like Tex's wife telling him, you got to do that better. And that was another thing, So why think that I don't, the Charlie Manson I knew I would definitely believe him capable of killing someone he wanted to kill without going to tell some teenagers, you should do it for me. Why? Mm-hmm. Why, and why did he go back to the LaBianca's house the next night? That he was involved with.
Right. Yeah.
And the thing is, he never denied cutting Hinman. He never denied shooting Crow. He never denied to me cutting Shea, even though he didn't kill him exactly. He did admit he was involved with the murder to the point that he cut him, which makes him culpable.
Right.
And he did this in broad daylight with other people watching him. This is not a frightened person who needs to send Susan Atkins to go kill for him.
No. Right.
That's what I mean. So I'm not saying, he's such a nice and sweet person, which I guess idiots think I've ever said, which I never have. On the contrary, he admitted I did, and he was proud of it. He never said, I wish I hadn't done that to Gary Hinman or Crow or Shea.
Right. And he's also, we had a recording from Ben Gorecki, who you spoke of earlier, and Manson talking about his time in Mexico and the time that they killed all these rats, and I was on the aggressor side. Now, not a lot has been said about Manson's time in Mexico, but it sounds like he had that similar sort of dangerous streak going on there.
Because I had been in Mexico a lot, and we, unbeknownst to me, when I went there in the early 80s, did a lot of similar things. Looked for shamans to take psychedelic drugs, went to the Pyramid of the Moon and the Sun in Teotihuacan, went to Acapulco. Strangely, all the things he'd done, I had done them. So we compared notes, and we both really liked Mexico. So he talked about it a lot. He definitely said many times, and to me and to different people, and even to the parole board, that he killed people in Mexico. He said, I left some people, I had a Magnum, I left some people dead on a beach. He told the parole board, I was arrested for murder of some French people in Mexico. He told Ben, he told lots of people I've known over the years. He talked to prisoners about that spoke to me about how that's how he got involved in drug dealing, cocaine from Cuba to Mexico and Miami, and he implied that he was still involved with the same narcotics trafficking network 10 years later. And I know for a fact that when I knew him in the 2000s, he was still in touch with Mexican drug cartels, and they have a very high respect for him, and they speak very highly of him. And and the way I know that, I've mentioned this before, in, I forget, 2000 something, he said, hey man, can you open a bank account for me in Berlin, and I'll send you the money, and you just keep the money, and it's my bank account, and just keep it there safely. And if I need something, then you could. And I absolutely didn't want anything. That's the last thing I need to do is money being sent from Charles Manson.
No, problem. Thank you.
Yeah. So I hesitated on that, but he took my address and he filled out the proper banking form from the prison to transfer from his account. And he had a lot of money in his account for all of his sob stories about everything. People sent him money constantly. So he had, and that's why other prisoners extorted him and threatened him, because he had access to money. So he sent me, I got the form from the bank, $1,000. And he said, I'm going to send in increments from Charlie Manson with his arrest. But because he couldn't speak, or because of dyslexia for one thing, but he couldn't read or speak German, he filled out the German address totally wrong. Therefore, the bank sent it to me refused, which, thank you.
Yeah.
And, but then I got a letter from Mexico saying, Charlie said that you can send me something from Mexico.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Wow.
And I didn't answer it. I mean,
No.
there were, but and he spoke Spanish. He respected Mexico, and definitely, I mean, he said it many times. So people who act like he was a coward, and furthermore, he's told me and other people quite proudly that he committed what is called the institutional murder. That when I'm not sure of the year, but when he was younger, to prove his place in the hierarchy, if somebody's a snitch or a child molester, or they've broken some of these many laws in the underworld code, you have to kill them if you get them. And he said he did. He said he killed someone, not that he wanted to, but to prove his place in the prison hierarchy. He told me and a few other people that. So this is someone very capable of killing. Why send people to do it?
Right. Well, it seems like there's a bit of a gray area when people are looking at the commune itself. And I think we'll be able to we've got about 15 minutes left in this interview, so we'll be able to get to it a bit more in the next one.
I'll just give you yes or no answers so we can get through.
Yes. Well. But one thing about, so while we're on that, then the commune is, a lot of people, like I said, think it's a bit of a gray area. They're not sure exactly what it is. Now, I've read the write-up by Dr. David Smith from the Haight-Ashbury about it being a group marriage. There was a chop shop, and they were using stolen credit cards. There was criminality going on there. But it's made to look like just a big jumbled mess. Like everyone had to do with everything that was going on there. They were all moving in one cohesive unit. Was it more that Manson had his commune and he would just get a cut if he I won't tell what you're doing. I don't care. It has nothing to do with me. Just give me my money. Was that kind of how things were running there?
That's the way he was in prison all the time I knew him.
Right.
I don't care where you got it. Give me money. I should get money. I mean, he had this, I have to say, a kind of entitled idea. His attitude was, society fucked me over. My mother fucked me over. I don't know who my father is. Nobody's ever given me a break. Therefore, I'm owed everything.
Right.
And if that's how he saw some kind of balance or karma. That was his attitude. So yeah, he didn't ask questions. But what was the commune? It wasn't any organized thing. It was a spontaneous coming together of a bunch of misfits. Now one thing I can say, he compartmentalized with women. I can tell you, he did not tell women everything he was doing, like many men of his generation and many people in the mob. There's this saying that actually Charlie Manson and Tom Metzger, the head of White Aryan Resistance, both said to me at different times, as far as criminal protocol, there's different ways of communication. They said there's television, telegram, telewife. And that's this old school thing. Don't talk to women, and certainly not to 18-year-old girls about. And Charlie compartmentalized his criminal activities from his other activities. Not everybody knew what was going on. So you had a group marriage. You had a chop shop. The men were very much involved in a fairly sophisticated auto theft ring that Charlie was, again, this was stuff he was doing since the 50s. Right. And he learned, Frank Costello in prison told him in the 50s, you need a front operation. If you're going to be a criminal, get a skill. And Charlie loved Frank Costello and listened to his advice and learned auto repair, which really means learned auto theft. Right. And that's what he did. He was very good at it. And he knew people like Bruce Davis and all these crooks and criminals who you never even think of. The Bill Vances, the thugs. These weren't hippies. He all these ex-cons he knew, he kept in touch with criminals all over the country. They were on the margins of the Vern Plumleys and the Bill Vances. Nobody thinks about them because they're not glamorous or
Right.
sexy or spooky. They're just thugs like you could meet in any criminal organization. And that, so all these things were happening at once. There is no, what it wasn't was a cult. What it wasn't was, and like I said, actually, like Charlie half jokingly said, well, everyone said I had a cult. Now I wish I could have a cult.
Yeah.
And he meant it. He wasn't thinking anything. And Charlie didn't make plans. He didn't
Right.
have, I think people look at, he got out of prison resentful of society and planned helter skelter. How can I gather my minions to hypnotize them to kill for? No, he didn't plan from one day to the next.
Right. And the cult thing, I mean, religion and crime. What about the mob? What about the mafia?
I had in this tape recording of this conversation we had that I was listening to that I told you about, he's talking about the mob as a religion. He's talking about the mafia. He very often said, the Holy Ghost, and he meant the mafia, and he meant God. God says you have to do this. You have to do this. He meant like you have no choice but to do what the mob tells you to do. So he saw it in a religious way. Absolutely. So let's get through some of your other questions. I want to try to follow your
all right. It's funny because I knew it was going to happen too. We've chipped away at a bunch of them.
Mm-hmm.
Danny, was there any on this first half that you thought we should definitely get to?
I was going to ask, when things started to fracture at the ranch, when the commune began to split, who were the two main cliques within that?
Well, that's hard to determine exactly because everyone remembers it differently. They're all high. They all have later resentments, and some of them like hated each other and then became friendly. So, like people remembering their high school years, it's very difficult to say. My impression is there was a clique around Tex, who was a slick drug dealer who was well dressed, living in the city, and more of a mod and not a hippie, not really trying to drop out of society. I get the impression a lot of the girls were not excited about moving out to the desert with scorpions and snakes in 110-degree weather and roughing it. Charlie loved it. They didn't love it so much. And Tex was more of like he was a slick, groovy drug dealer. And I think there was a Tex faction. Linda was definitely of that faction, but just like now, you can see that everybody is quite clear and evident. Everyone who knew Charlie in recent years is all feuding with each other, stabbing each other in the back, hating each other, saying I'm the whatever.
Yeah,
that was going on in the ranch clearly, and because of Charlie's habit of playing people against each other. And why did they all betray him ultimately, except for a handful? Because that kind of psychological tension, when they had the opportunity to save their lives, they blamed it all on him. And that, I mean, there's nothing cult-like about that. There are cults who have stuck together after committing horrible crimes. The Japanese poison cult, for instance, they never snitched on each other or expressed resentment. There's been many other cults. This was not a cult. As soon as you got the police coming saying you're going to go to prison and possibly to the gas chamber, he did it. That's not a cult leader.
Yeah.
Where's the messianic belief? Like Susan Atkins immediately, okay, yep, he did it all. He told us to do it. And and Tex Watson is supposed to be his most hypnotized right-hand man who would kill for him and die for him. And yet, just a few months later, he did it all. He hypnotized me. He put his voice in my head. That's not a cult. That's ordinary criminals blaming it on who they can blame.
Right. Yeah. And I think that's huge for people to know, is that it isn't just because it feels like the whole thing's been compressed. They've taken all the stories that fit the narrative, all the people, just to make it seem like it's all in a tight neat little bundle.
Well, the media has done a lot of that, in that the way that newspapers, magazines, and hack writers have to tell a very clear and unambiguous story, that with good and evil and a plot, and there was no plot. It's chaos.
Right.
It was sheer chaos. And a sociopath on methadone has a lot, methamphetamine has a lot to do with what happened. There's
Yeah.
nothing very mysterious about that. I've known quite a few sociopaths on meth, and I mean, also an important thing is the drug dealing experience that I had, that I mentioned in the early part of the book, and how that tied into something much later. I think that's important about these two lawyers of Tex Watson.
Right. All right. Well, we're coming up on the end of this one, so
is there anything I can quickly address of your other questions? I mean, we have time to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want. It doesn't matter to me.
Well,
we can go as long
we're
as
not
you
doing
want.
this again, so let's
Yeah.
do it.
All right. Well, so you said earlier a name that is super interesting to me, and that's Charlene Cafritz. Can you explain who Charlene Cafritz was, what she had to do with Manson and the commune, and how she was tied to Sharon Tate and the Hollywood people as well?
Yeah, according to now, I've never seen him talk about her anywhere else, but in 2012, when I visited Charlie in December of 2012, and we had many hours to discuss everything, I don't know how she came up, but she did. And I asked, well, what was the deal with Charlene Cafritz? And he said, well, what I said was, do you think she died mysteriously? Because let me explain who she was for people who may not be familiar with the case. Charlene Cafritz was the young daughter of a very prominent family in Washington that were involved with the State Department, involved with the Kennedy and Johnson administration. And she married into another even more prominent Democratic Party donor, socialites on the Washington, D.C. scene, the Cafritz family. A lot of people think she's the heiress to the Cafritz family. She's not. She was from another prominent political family, and like aristocracy, they marry into the same group. And so she married into this very wealthy socialite Cafritz family. And then she divorced her husband, and he left her a huge amount of alimony. And she became a groupie in California, starting with Dennis Wilson and many other rock stars. And Dennis Wilson got tired of her. Apparently she was into S&M, and Dennis was not particularly. And this apparently happened quite a lot. Dennis would foist off women he was sick of on Charlie. So, and apparently Mama Cass, I believe, introduced Cafritz to their scene. I'm not sure about that, but I believe that's what it was. So it's all very incestuous. So
Right.
Charlene then fell in love with Charlie totally. And as I mentioned before, she called her nickname was Charlie. So they were Charlie and Charlie. And she had all this money, and Charlie, being Charlie, spent it very quickly on, had her buy musical equipment, bought a car, which he, in this entitled way, he complained it was the wrong car. And now in talking to me in 2012 in the prison visiting room, he was praising her, being quite honest that he wasn't even particularly attracted to her, but using her for her money and being like a gigolo. He said she really liked sex. She was, and so he had sex with her. He filmed porno films with her and for her, with some of the girls at what seems to be a ranch that she owned. As far as I could tell, it was a whorehouse.
Right. And it's made to sound like that in Lynette Fromey's book, Reflection, as well.
But interesting, Lynette Fromm doesn't describe porno or sex, but she does just hint at the S&M, a boot and whip lady, and the possibility of whorehouse, which Charlie said it was a whorehouse and that they filmed porno. For what reason, I don't know if it was commercial or personal, but that they did. But they seemed to be doing that all the time. There's nothing extraordinary. And then I said to him, do you think, but he was treating her like he didn't particularly like her, that he was fucking her because she would pay for anything he asked for.
She was bankroll.
Yeah, exactly. And And he said that of a lot of the women who joined the commune. He said, I didn't particularly like them. They had this much money and they were willing to give it. He was quite honest about that. So I asked him, she died in St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is a mental hospital in Washington, D.C., where Ezra Pound had been put during the war, after the war, and John Hinckley after the Reagan shooting. It's a famous lunatic asylum. And she had drug problems. She was arrested for heroin possession and put in there. And a lot of people, more of the people in the CIA, mind control, government, blah, 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 way of thought tend to think, oh, she was murdered. She was silenced in St. Elizabeth's. And I don't think so. And I asked Charlie. Now, Charlie was the first one to believe a conspiracy theory. You know, he had told me things like Michael Jackson isn't dead. They just pretended he is. Nicole Brown Simpson, she's not dead. And he once told me, if you ever hear I'm dead, it just means they slipped me out the back door. Don't believe it. So, so he was the first to believe bizarre conspiracy theories. So I said, what do you think happened to Charlene? He said she was just out of her head and on drugs all the time. She was going to OD at any moment. And he said,
right.
he just said that would be totally predictable. And she said she was way out of her element. And she said being between everybody. And I said, what do you mean? And I said, you mean Sharon Tate? She said, yeah. And he said this very casually, not like it's a big secret, as he always did. He said, yeah, man, all these people knew each other.
Right. And that's interesting that you say she was kind of in over her head, because I feel like that's kind of a theme for some of the murders, like especially in the Hollywood scene. It's like all these people that don't have a lot of rules on them and start to overreach and do things like Wojtek Frykowski, thinking that he can like rape a drug dealer and just go about his merry way and rip people off and whatever.
This is something that I think it happened in the 60s, that ethical and moral compass deteriorated to the point where let it all hang out became do anything to anybody and not fearing the consequences. Yeah. And then it becomes a very thin line between crime and revolution. And I think there was a confusion between freedom and criminality. And Charlie played on that, and I think he sincerely believed it too. Like, okay, we're against the establishment, so it's a revolutionary act to break all their rules and to rip off the man and to, so.
Right. And that's why sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
That's why there was a bunch of revolutionaries who were revolutionaries and stuff who were kind of drawn to him after the fact, even though they were kind of looking at it wrong.
Well, yeah, and if we get into the political thing in the next part, I mean, people would like to forget on the left that Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin were very enthusiastic supporters of Charlie. Mm-hmm. Abby Hoffman and his wife went to visit the girls at the ranch to support them during the trial. Jerry Rubin went to the prison and visited Charlie, and I write about it in the book, in a mainstream book, praised Charlie highly. I'm sure he was cringing after he was convicted, but people would like to forget that the Weathermen supported the murders. Bernadine Dorn, one of the most prominent left-wing radical leaders, came out and supported the murders and said they, far out, they killed those rich pigs and stuck a fork in them. So that has all been covered up. The radical left wing of the counterculture, which by no means was it all left, but that wing definitely were pro-Manson. At this Weatherman convention, these people were saying Manson power, and had a picture of Sharon Tate on their wall at this meeting that was called the Wargasm meeting. I believe it was held in Detroit, as if Sharon Tate is like the symbol of capitalist fascist oppression.
Right.
And then years later, you had neo-Nazis supporting Charlie with the same enthusiasm as Abby Hoffman and the Yippies did. So he was a polarizing force that every extreme could find something in.
Oh, and he's still used in to sell magazines, to do all sorts of stuff. It's like he has gone so far beyond being a person that anybody, like it could find something in him to be able to put him up as a poster boy.
Right. And imagine being that person and trying to figure out who you are yourself. Imagine
Right.
waking up every day and you're everything to everybody. How do you know who you are? And I think he was quite honest about not knowing.
Right. All right. Well, that'll do it for part 1. We're
right.
at our time here.
Well,
so
I'm not coming back after that for part 2.
Forget it.
That's enough
All
of
right.
that.
Well, this has been our one part.
You can cut it into 2 parts, but I'm sure the hell not coming back for more.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. So we'll stop this now, and then we'll come back. Nikolas Schreck might be with us.
We'll see.
We'll see.
We'll see. I'll roll a dime and see.
See what happens.
All right. So there'll be a little bit of suspense, and we'll see if I come back or not.
Yeah, perfect. All right. Thank you. We'll talk to you in a few.
Thank you. And thank you for all of you for listening, and we may or may not see you soon.